Hello class, this video is on Edmund Spenser. We'll be talking mostly about the Faerie Queene. In this video, we're going to start with an outline of Spenser's life. There he is. So he was born in 1552 to a father who probably was involved in the textiles business in some way. Basically, a middle-class family. Like Shakespeare, Spenser benefited from mid-16th century educational reforms that made a classical education accessible to middle-class boys. Spenser attended the New Merchant Taylor's School, which was headed by a very famous lexicographer named Richard Mulcaster. And this school had a reputation for a very rigorous curriculum in classical languages and also, unusually for the time, English. So this is where the seeds were laid for Spenser's literary career. So after completing his university education at Cambridge in the 1570s, he attended there on a scholarship. He basically was a servant. That's how his education was paid for, doing various chores for the university. After completing his bachelor's and master's degrees, he was appointed a personal secretary to Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I. And it was through Robert Dudley that Spenser probably met Sir Philip Sidney, who was Dudley's nephew. And that was an important early formative relationship for Spenser because, of course, Sir Philip Sidney was an accomplished poet. In 1579, he marries Maccabea's child, with whom he would have 2 children. And also in that year publishes the Shepherd's Calendar is not his first publication, but it's his first major one, and it is dedicated to Sidney. 1580 is a major, a big event for Spenser in his life. He travels to Ireland as secretary to Lord Grey of Wilton, who was the Lord Deputy of Ireland. So basically, Queen Elizabeth's chief executive officer in Ireland. Ireland had come under the rule of the English monarchy in 1542 with the Crown of Ireland Act. This was under King Henry VIII. And so Ireland was controlled by a Catholic dominant country, was controlled by Protestant England, and that would set in motion all kinds of strife, as one can imagine, and this would continue for centuries. Once he arrived there, he was immediately involved in suppressing a Catholic insurrection that would end with the siege of Smerwick and the mass execution of rebels, many of them Italian and Spanish Catholic soldiers who were there to support Ireland. And at this time, he's possibly working on the Faerie Queene. So in the 1580s, he serves in various minor government posts in the Munster Plantation. This is an area of Irish land confiscated and settled by the English. And eventually, he was rewarded with a 3,000-acre estate at Kilcolman in North Cork. So large swaths of land were being given to English administrators. Sir Walter Raleigh had tens of thousands of acres, and was one of Spenser's neighbors. And Sir Walter Raleigh, of course, famous courtier, adventurer, and poet, and they would become, he and Spenser would become friends. And it was Raleigh who, in 1589, accompanied Spenser to England, where Spenser presented the Faerie Queene, the first 3 books, to Queen Elizabeth I, who was very pleased, of course, and granted Spenser a lifetime pension of £50 per year. So a pretty significant sum, and significant for somebody like Spenser who didn't have the aristocratic pedigree of some of his fellow poets. In 1590, William Ponsonby publishes the first 3 books of the Faerie Queene. The other 3 would be published later. And this would require Spenser to make an adjustment to the end of the 3rd book, which we'll talk about later. And you can see there on the title page that the plan was to have it in 12 books that would define these 12 moral virtues. Spenser would end up only completing 6, but it's still impressive, the 6 that he completed. So by 1594, he's back in Ireland, and it's a war-torn country, but he marries Elizabeth Boyle. I do not know what happened to his first wife, unfortunately. But he addresses his most famous sonnet sequence, or one of the most famous sonnet sequences of the Renaissance, to her, called the Amoretti. We'll be reading some of those later. And he writes an ode commemorating their wedding, the Epithalamion. Another famous poem of his. In 1596, he writes what is probably today would be considered his most controversial work, A View of the Present State of Ireland. It was not published until 1633, and basically it is a prose dialogue defending the former Lord Deputy's scorched earth genocidal tactics in Ireland. And he publishes the 6th book, Faerie Queene, that same year. And Ireland would figure pretty significantly in book 5 of the 6th book, Faerie Queene. That's Sir Artegal's book, the Book of Justice. It doesn't really, Ireland doesn't really come up in book 3. There is an episode in book 9 when Britomart is describing the early conquest of England in ancient times, and it does seem to allude to, one could read it as a symbol of contemporary colonial violence in Ireland. If you're reading it, looking for that, and I think that's a legitimate way to read it. So in 1598, this is towards the end of the 9 Years' War between the Irish rebels and the English forces. In fact, this was the largest war that took place during Queen Elizabeth's reign, and Spenser's home at Kilcolman is looted and burned down. I read somewhere one time that one of his children died in this incident. I don't know. I haven't verified that. That's just something I remember reading somewhere one time. He returns to England with letters reporting on the Irish crisis, but he comes down with some illness while he's there and dies early in 1599, aged 46 or 47 years old. And he's buried near his idol, Chaucer, in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey, and that's his monument there that you can see on the left. In 1609, a posthumous edition of the Faerie Queene, the most complete edition, which included for the first time the so-called mutability cantos. This is a fragment of a 7th book that Spenser never completed. It's a pretty substantial fragment, though. Quite a few stanzas. So we're going to talk about the structure of the Faerie Queene as it was written in a letter, as it was written and published, even though it wasn't completed, in a letter to Sir Walter Raleigh appended to the 3-book 1590 edition of the Faerie Queene. Spenser explains the purpose of the poem is to, quote, fashion a gentleman or noble person in virtuous and gentle discipline. In other words, to instruct readers in the high moral values and proper conduct of the English ruling class. So to keep readers interested in this, admittedly, that doesn't sound very interesting, right? So he goes on to say that he colored his argument with a historical fiction the which, he says, the most part of men delight to read, rather for variety of matter than for profit of the ensample. So the basic idea here is to instruct the reader by entertaining the reader. So the vehicle that Spenser chose for this instruction was the chivalric romance, so sword and sorcery tales of questing knights and damsels in distress that had been popular since the Middle Ages. Chaucer provides the best early examples of this in English, the Knight's Tale, for example. So to enhance this connection to the Middle Ages and to Chaucer, Spenser, throughout the Faerie Queene, adopts this faux Chaucerian language and orthography that even some of his contemporaries found artificial and arcane, and really startles contemporary readers. He is not much interested in character development or linear plot. This also can be a source of frustration for readers today. Most of his characters are highly symbolic. They represent beliefs and values, rather than, you can't really think of them as being, people in the sense of like characters in a realist novel, for example. And the objective of the plot, which is highly episodic, is just to create situations that challenge and exercise the beliefs and values represented by the characters. And this doubled layer meaning is the very nature of allegory. Certainly the Faerie Queene is the best example of long-form allegorical verse during the English Renaissance. So in the Raleigh letter, Spenser explicitly announces his ambition to use the material of romance to write an epic, a long narrative poem that serves as a historical record and as a repository of cultural knowledge. And he mentions not just the ancient epics of Homer and Virgil, to which he'd no doubt been exposed while he was a boy studying under Richard Mulcaster at the Merchant Taylor School, but also the more contemporary Italian poets, Ariosto, Torquato Tasso, whose popular epics provided the model for the Faerie Queene as this ambitious two-part project in 24 books. He would never even begin, as far as I know, and as anyone knows, he would never begin the second part. He did get about halfway through the first part, completing 6 of the anticipated 12 books. And in the first part, the goal was to define, the moral qualities of a man of virtue. And then the second would be to show how those qualities combined to make an effective leader, to sort of show those qualities in the practice of statecraft and governance. So the legendary figure that Spenser chose to represent this ideal individual was King Arthur, who appears sporadically throughout the first 6 books of the poem. And Spenser says that King Arthur would embody this 13th virtue called magnificence, which would be the combination of all 12 of the other moral virtues that he would describe in the full scope of the poem. Each of the other virtues is represented by a single knight. So, for example, Book 1, which maybe you've read in your British Literature Survey class, is the virtue is holiness, and it's represented by the Red Cross Knight, who's also identified in Book 1 as St. George, the patron saint of England, and the Red Cross Knight also makes an appearance in Book 3 of the Faerie Queene. Book 2, the virtue is temperance, so sobriety, restraint, represented by Sir Guyon, who struggles with this in the opening of Book 3, which is Britomart's book, and she embodies the moral virtue of chastity. And Book 4 is a little unusual because the moral virtue is friendship, but it involves 2 characters, Campbell and Telamond. And a lot of the relationships that are left irresolved at the end of book 3, like, for example, Florimel and Marinel and Timaeus and Belphoebe, a lot of those relationships get resolved in book 4. Florimel and Marinel finally get married. In book 5, this is the Book of Justice. This involves Sir Artegall. This is the knight with whom Brudamart is in love, and she comes in and rescues him fantastically in book 5 from some Amazons. And then book 6, the last book that Spenser completed, is Courtesy, represented by Sir Calidore. So before we delve into the Faerie Queene, we've got to talk about the Spenserian stanza. This is a verse form that Spenser invented. It's incredibly intricate, very, very difficult to do in a sustained kind of way. What's really impressive about this stanza, besides just the technical requirements of it, is the fact that Spenser wrote thousands of these. Just the six books of the Faerie Queene we have. Just remember, they're 6 books, 12 cantos per book, with between 40 and 70 stanzas per canto. We're talking about thousands of these stanzas, and they're technically very, very difficult, particularly the rhyme scheme involved. There are 2 A rhymes in the stanza, so you see plain and remain here. And then what makes it especially difficult is the B rhyme, of which there are 4 in this particular stanza. This is stanza 1 of Canto 1 of Book 1 of the Faerie Queene. And we've got shield, field, wield, and yield is the B rhyme. And then there's a C rhyme that closes out the stanza with tidily, with a couplet. It is, for the most part, iambic. So if you look at the first, it's the first line there. I've shown you the unstressed and the stressed syllable there. A gentle. So there's the unstressed A, and then the stressed gentle. And then there's the next iambic foot. The next one, unstressed followed by stressed, unstressed followed by stressed, unstressed followed by stressed. And there are 5 stressed syllables in the line. So a gentle knight was pricking on the plain. So it's a 5-foot line, which is iambic pentameter. So if you'd like, you can pause the video at this point, take a look at that next line and scan it and see if you can identify the stressed syllables in that line. Okay. Put them up there. Clad in mighty arms and silver shield. So again, 5 iambic feet, pentameter. And every line in the Spenserian stanza is like this, except the last one. So you can look at the last line, and you'll see that it has not 1, not 2, not 5, but 6 iambic feet. Every Spenserian stanza ends with that, and it is called an alexandrine. That's a line of iambic hexameter. And the hexameter line just sort of breaks up the monotony of the pentameter. So it makes a really nice, tidy stanza, and it reads really well. They were not very popular in later 17th and 18th centuries when the heroic couplet was the main form. But Spenserian stanzas became popular again. Some of the Romantic poets, Wordsworth and Shelley, later Swinburne, Keats wrote some in the Spenserian stanza, so it became popular again much later. So before we get into book 3, I think it would be helpful to identify some of the major characters. I don't mention all of the characters here. Like, I leave out the Greco-Roman gods, Proteus, Venus, Diana, And I leave out some of the other minor figures. I don't think I put braggadocio in here. But I've grouped them into four, and I'll just talk briefly about them because they're going to come up often when we get to the summary of Book 3. So we've got Britomart, of course, who is the female knight, the embodiment of the moral virtue of chastity in here. Artegall, he's mentioned for the first time in Book 2, Canto 2, stanza 8. He doesn't appear in Book 3. He will appear in Book 4. He meets Britomart in Book 4, but he has to be mentioned because Britomart is in love with him, even though she hasn't met him yet, and he's got to be here. Arthur, Prince Arthur appears, Canto 1, first stanza. The Red Cross Knight, who is the major figure in Book 1 of the Faerie Queene. He makes an appearance here. Marinel appears. He's a knight. Canto 4, stanza 12. Saturaine, Saturaine is in love with Florimel, who's in love with Marinel. The Squire of Dames has an interesting story. That is in Canto 7. And then finally, Scudamore, who appears late in Book 3 in Canto 11. So in contrast to these knights, all of whom are for the most part virtuous, although some of them are a little ambiguous, particularly the Squire of Dames, there are definite lecherous men in Book 3, starting with the Forester. This is the first one we meet, who's pursuing Florimel through the forest, terrorizing her. There's the Witch's Son. Most of these men persecute Florimel at some point. The Witch's Son is one in Canto 7. The fisherman, who actually rapes her in Canto 7. Paradel in Canto 8, who runs off with Helenor, Malbecco's wife. Malbecco himself in Canto 9. And then the wizard, the evil wizard Buzzarain, who finally appears in the very last canto of Book 3. And then we have the damsels, the women who represent virtue in some form. Florimel, of course, I've mentioned her already. And then we have Belphoebe, who's sort of a quasi-mythological fairy being. She is not mortal. And she appears in Canto 5. And then her twin sister, Amoret, who loves Scudamore. And Scudamore is so ineffectual when he appears in Canto 11. Then finally, Columbell, who is the Squire of Dames, beloved. And then, of course, just as there are lecherous men, there are a few lascivious women. Among them, the first one we meet is Malicasta in the very first canto, in the 20th stanza at Castle Joyous. We'll talk about that scene. There's the giantess Argante, and she's something. She and her brother Oliphant, they are born engaged in incest with each other as they come out of the womb. It's pretty striking when that's described in Book 3. And she has sex with animals, and she's something. And then Malbecco's wife Helenor in Book 9, who is the one, despite the grotesqueness of Argante, Helenor is the figure that Spenser seems to be the most careful with in terms of cautioning the reader about her, which is interesting. And that gets us into the poems, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So before I talk about specific scenes, I'm going to go through and summarize the first 6 cantos of Book 3, just to get the story down. It's a lot to remember. It'll be a fairly quick summary. And then when I finish the summary, I'll go over a few of about 10 different parts that I would like for you to reread and to be responsible for. So here are the 6 cantos. These are Walter Crane's vignettes from an edition of the Faerie Queene that was published in the 1890s. Just a beautiful edition. There are full-page illustrations in that edition as well. So we'll start with Canto 1 here, which begins with, it doesn't begin with a poem. There's a poem that begins Book 3. We're going to talk about the poems a little bit later in this video. So the first 12 stanzas, basically what happens here is Arthur and Guyon, they're out, they're questing about, and they happen across Britomart, who for some reason suddenly charges at them, and she unseats Guyon. This is very embarrassing for Guyon, whose moral virtue is temperance, and he gets pretty hot in this episode. But Arthur brokers a peaceful resolution between them, and then Spenser remarks on that in stanza 13, and we'll talk about those remarks a little bit later in the video. In stanzas 14 to 19, Arthur, Guyon, and Britomart, they enter a forest and they encounter Florimel. She's actually not named until much later, I think Canto 5, I think. But she's fleeing from the lecherous forester, and Arthur and Guyon take off after her, and then Arthur's squire, Timaeus, pursues the forester. And we learn the outcomes of these different adventures a little later in the poem. In stanzas 20 through 30, now she's on her own. Britomart leaves the forest. She walks up on the Red Cross Knight, who's fighting a group of 6 men. And later we learn that they're brothers, and we get their names. Britomart comes in, she puts an end to the fight, and she learns that these knights, the knights that are fighting, who are fighting Red Cross, serve a woman named Malatesta, who lives in the nearby castle that's called Castle Joyous, and that's where they go next. Stanzas 31 to 33, we get a description of the castle, and then stanzas 34 to 38, there's a tapestry that's described, the Venus and Adonis tapestry, a little section of ekphrasis or description of art. And Spenser really gets into this in Canto 11 when Britomart goes into the house of Buzzerain, and there's a whole hallway of tapestries that are described. I think this one is interesting because it describes the myth of Venus and Adonis, and this is the centerpiece of Canto 6 when Venus takes Amoret back to the Garden of Adonis. So it's interesting to get this description of the myth here very early in the poem. In stanzas 39 to 57, Britomart, she finds the sensual indulgences and lewd behavior going on at Castle Joyous really disgusting. She refuses to take off her armor. Malatesta, not realizing Britomart's biological sex, wants to sleep with her, which sets up the climactic scene in stanzas 58 to 67. So after a long night of feasting and orgying, everyone goes off to bed, and Malatesta sneaks into Britomart's closet and slips into her bed. Britomart, of course, she resists right away. Everyone is awakened by Malatesta's surprise, and Britomart is revealed to be a woman. And she's described here, I like these lines. They saw the warlike maid, all in her snow-white smock, with locks unbound, threatening the point of her avenging blade. So I like that description. It's like their first view of Britomart is her with Malacasta under the sword, which is pretty remarkable. So a scuffle breaks out. Britomart is wounded actually by an arrow, and it's intriguing that she does not come out of this episode unscathed. Red Cross assists Britomart in dispersing the assailants, and they leave the castle. So in Canto 2 now, the first 3 stanzas are a proem, and again, we'll talk about the proems a little later. Stanzas 4 through 16, Red Cross inquires into Britomart's origin, and she deliberately misleads him by not disclosing her love for Artegal, which is the whole reason she's come to Fairyland in the first place. She claims to have come in search of adventure. She says, "All my delight on deeds of arms is set," which is not exactly true. She's being a little dishonest there. So further, she fabricates the story that Artegal once did some injury to her, and that she hopes to challenge him in a contest of arms. And Arthur immediately defends Artegal's character, which of course, Britomart, she was fishing for this all along, and she's very pleased by Arthur's report. And then from stanzas 17 to 52, just a really long section. I lumped a bunch of things together here, but basically it's the story of how she fell in love with Artegal when she saw his image in a magic mirror, or maybe it's a crystal ball. She falls into a love melancholy, and she's attended to by her older nurse Glossy, who later becomes her squire when she puts on armor and poses as a knight. Glossy becomes her squire. Glossy tries various treatments. There's some church, there's some purgatives. She does a little light magic, and none of this works. So she agrees to help Britomart go on a quest to find Artegal. Obviously, they need to be together. So Canto 3 continues this story. Again, it starts with a proem, and then stanzas 5 through 7, Glossy and Britomart go to see Merlin. They want his advice. He's the one who gave her father, King Rience, the magic mirror. So let's go. Glossy's like, let's go see Merlin. Maybe he can help us find Artegal. In stanzas 8 through 13, we get this account of Merlin's cave and a little bit of Merlin's backstory. And then in stanzas 14 to 28, Merlin tells Britomart about Artegal. She gives him a name. I can tell you who this person is, and that someday you're going to marry this man. So in stanzas 29 to 50, we get this really lengthy nationalistic account of Britomart's descendants and their wars against various barbarian groups in the history of medieval England, the Saxons, the Danes, the Normans, and then their ultimate triumph and the establishment of the Tudor monarchy, which of course is Queen Elizabeth. And then stanzas 51 to 53, Britomart arms herself, determined now to go to Fairyland in quest of Artegal, and Glossy will go with her, although Glossy seems invisible for most of Book 3. It's like when she's mentioned at the very end of Canto 12, it's like, oh yeah, Glossy was with her this whole time. Stanzas 54 to 56, Spenser adds Britomart to the roster of historical warrior women. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the proems a little later. I just think that's an important moment. And 57 to 62, Britomart finally, she arrives in Fairyland. And then at the end of Canto 3, she's finished. We get all this backstory about Britomart, and then she and Red Cross go their separate ways. So Canto 4, she is now on her own she's with Glossy. The first 3 stanzas of Canto 4, we have another proem. Stanzas 4 to 11, a description. I think this is a really beautiful part of the poem, a description of Britomart on the coast. sort of expressing her love melancholy, and we'll take a look at that in more detail a little later. Stanzas 12 through 18, Sir Marinell arrives and challenges Britomart and is gravely wounded in the contest. And this will set in motion a number of other events, particularly involving Florimel, who's in love with Sir Marinell. She hears that he's wounded and she goes looking for him, and then all these people go out looking for her. So there's a sort of domino effect that comes out of this particular scene. Stanzas 19 through 28, we're going to take a closer look at Marinell's origin and his relationship with his mother Simoent. So I'll save that bit for later. Stanzas 29 to 43, Simoent and the Nereids attend to the injured Marinell. They take him back to Simoent's love, her undersea bower, to attend to him. And stanzas 44 and 45, this is very brief. This a really bizarre episode. It dangles and it doesn't get tied off here. Archimago he's a major villain in the Faerie Queene up to this point, particularly in book 1. He really makes life difficult for the Red Cross Knight, and then he appears here, and then he never appears again in the Faerie Queene. It's just a strange loose thread in the weave of the poem. Stanzas 46 to 54, Arthur continues his pursuit of Florimel, who of course has been terrorized by the Forester, and she doesn't know who Arthur is, so she keeps running from him. He can't catch up with her or convince her to trust him, quite understandably, I think. In stanzas 55 to 60, so she, like I said, she doesn't recognize Arthur or know his motives for coming after her. And so Arthur, he's frustrated and he falls into this bout of love melancholy, which is not just about Florimel, but also the melancholy he feels for the equally elusive Gloriana, or the Faerie Queene, whom he truly loves and is his ultimate goal, romantic goal. So Canto 5 now. Canto 5 also has a proem. And stanzas 3 through 12, this is where Arthur encounters a dwarf. These dwarf characters appear sporadically throughout the Faerie Queene, who explains that Florimel loves Sir Marinell, who of course wants nothing to do with women due to his mother's warnings about them, which we'll take a look at later. And so when Florimel learned that Sir Marinell had been hurt in his fight with Britomart, she abruptly goes out on her own to find him, and now she has lots of concerned individuals who are out looking for her. Stanzas 13 through 26, Arthur's squire Timaeus, who went off after the Forester. You remember, he finds the Forester and his brothers. He kills them all. A really violent fight scene in book 3, but he's hurt very badly during the fighting. He is near death. And in stanzas 27 to 38, he is discovered by Belphoebe, who's out been hunting, and she finds him and tends to his wounds. And then in stanzas 39 to 44, he, of course, falls in love with her, which is not good for Timaeus. Because as we learn in stanzas 45 through 47, his love for her is honorable, it's chaste, but it's unfortunately misplaced, because Belphoebe is constitutionally incapable of returning his affection at this point. In his complaint, with the really memorable refrain of "die, rather die," he pledges his unwavering loyalty to her. But we can only read this ambiguously. You know, are we supposed to admire him for his commitment to Belphoebe, even though she does not requite his affection, or are we supposed to pity him because she represents virginity and chastity? She's not going to requite his love. So finally, stanzas 48 to 55, Timaeus begins to decline. Belphoebe wonders if she just hasn't treated his injuries well enough, but of course it's love sickness that is causing him to waste away. So Canto 6 now, probably the most famous canto in Book 3 of the Faerie Queene because of the Garden of Adonis episode. Also, of course, starts with a proem, as all the first 6 cantos do. Stanzas 3 through 10, we are introduced to this woman named Chrysogone, who she was having a really easy day. She went for a swim. It's nice outside. She takes a nap and she wakes up pregnant. We're told that she was impregnated by the sun, and ashamed to be seen in this condition, because obviously it compromises her. She goes and she hides in the forest, and then bizarrely, while she's asleep, she gives birth to the twins, Belphoebe and Amoret, who are really dual aspects of Spenser's conception of love. The Belphoebe representing chastity, and Amoret representing sexual attraction, physical intimacy, physical pleasure. And then in stanzas 11 through 26, Venus has been tracking her son Cupid's path of destruction from royal courts to the cities, to the countryside, and she can't find him. And so finally she's out in the remote wilderness where Diana lives, with the nymphs, the huntresses, and she meets up with the virgin goddess Diana, and they very clearly do not get along, for obvious reasons. They represent very different things, different ideas, but ultimately Venus persuades Diana to assist in her search for Cupid, and we're going to take just a quick look at that a little later in this video. Stanzas 27 to 29, they find the twins, and each, Diana and Venus find the twins, and they each adopt one of them. And so, in a funny way, Chrysogone, she gives birth, she got pregnant, and she gives birth, and then she loses the twins all while she's asleep, which is, that's strange. So in stanzas 30 to 38, 30 to 48, I'm sorry, Diana adopts Belphoebe, Venus adopts Amoret and takes her to the Garden of Adonis. So we get this strange account of the Garden of Adonis in stanzas 30 to 48. And then stanzas 49 to 54, we learn that Amoret is raised by Psyche, another child of Venus, and she will later be taken to the fairy court, where she falls in love with Sir Scudamore, to whom we will be introduced in Canto 11. So at this point, we're going to take a look at some of the more important episodes that I'd like for you to take a look at yourselves and study again. I'm going to start with the proems, and again, Book 3 starts with the proem. It identifies chastity as the theme of Book 3. But I would say more broadly, Book 3 is about the complexity of feelings of love. You get the feeling reading Book 3 that Spenser's really struggling, trying to define love in a way that accommodates sexuality and physical pleasure. It's something he really seems to struggle with and want to figure out. I think one of the nicest expressions of this in the poem is in Book 5. The very opening lines of Book 5, he says, "Wonder it is to see in diverse minds how diversely love doth its pageants play, and shows his power in variable kinds." And I think in a way that's really ultimately what Book 3 is about. But the moral virtue that he focuses on is chastity, which in the poem he links directly to Queen Elizabeth. And the poem is really, it's addressed directly to her. Remember, Sir Walter Raleigh takes Spenser to London, probably gets her an audience with the Queen, and he can present the Faerie Queene to her. And he addresses her directly here. And at the end of this opening poem, he identifies her with two important characters in the Faerie Queene. One being Gloriana, who is the Faerie Queene, the elusive Gloriana, whom Arthur is trying to work his way toward. And then the other is Belphoebe, who appears in Book 3 in the middle cantos, and of course represents chastity. He also uses this opening poem to praise Sir Walter Raleigh, who was himself an accomplished poet. And at this time, in the early 1590s, he was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, but not for long. He would make a series of relationship mistakes that would cause him to fall out of favor with her. But I think Spenser is also mentioning him because by association, this establishes some political as well as poetical legitimacy for himself, Raleigh already being an accomplished poet. So the other poems in cantos 2 through 6, in the first half of of Book 3, these poems, they're more frequent and they're longer than they are in the second half of the poem. The poem to Canto 3 contains an obligatory invocation to the muse of epic poetry. The muse's name is Clio. That's just a stock epic convention. But really what's interesting about the poems are these emphases that he has. And I've identified three. One of them is praise of Queen Elizabeth, whom he identifies explicitly as a direct descendant of Britomart. And he does this in many of the poems. He often mentions Queen Elizabeth. He also frequently singles out female readers, female members of his audience, and directly encourages them to model their behavior after Britomart, who's the heroic embodiment of chaste love, and for them to discipline themselves against feelings of lust and jealousy. This was a frequent theme of the poems. The most interesting example of this for me is actually the poem to Book 9, where he apologizes to his sensitive readers, male and female, for the account he's about to give of the really tawdry liaison between Paridel and Helenor. And in that poem, he stresses that section of Book 3 is to be read as a negative example of how not to behave. And it's always really fascinating to me when I get the sense that writers are uncomfortable with their subject matter, whether it's for professional or personal reasons. And the poem to Book 9 has that interest, raises that interest for me. In the poems, he also comments several times on the lack of strong martial women in chivalric romance in comparison to ancient literary tradition. He mentions some of the women warriors of ancient poets like Penthesilea, who is an Amazon, part of the Homeric epic cycle. Camilla in the Aeneid. He also mentions Deborah in the Old Testament as these strong fighting women. And he gives some really interesting reasons why women aren't, what happened to these strong women in medieval romance. So you can look for that in some of the poems. And he presents Britomart in Book 3 as a redress of that negligence on the part of predominantly male writers. And finally, probably the most important of the themes that comes out in the poems is the distinction between love and lust. Like I said, this is something that Spenser really struggles with. Lust is base and physical. It is selfish, whereas true love, Spenser believes, motivates acts of selflessness and heroism. And yet he can't quite suppress or come to easy terms with the physicality of love, since it is necessary for men to procreate and raise up new generations of heroes and princes. And this difficulty really comes through, I think, in the Garden of Adonis scene in Book 6. So we'll talk about the first stanza. I would like for you to go back and take a look at again is the 13th stanza of the first canto, where, remember, this is where Britomart, she's just unseated Guyon from his horse, and Guyon's really embarrassed, and then Arthur comes in and sort of smooths the situation over, and they all go off riding together, and they're all fine, they're all friends suddenly. And this allows Spenser to idealize the courtly Middle Ages. He calls them antique times, when men respected their enemies and they fought for honor, not for malice or for personal gain. And the implication in this stanza is that those times are gone, that those ideas have been lost. He says, let later age envy that time. And you got to remember, when he's writing the Faerie Queene, he's living in Ireland. It's war torn. There's political corruption. Just not. It doesn't. I'm sure that didn't feel like a very chivalric time to Edmund Spenser, who was witnessing wholesale slaughter and strife on a daily basis. Stanzas 24 through 25, Britomart has discovered Red Cross fighting the brothers who serve Malacasta. And the reason that they're fighting is because he will not abandon his true love. And her name is not given here, but her name is Una. And their story is given fuller treatment in Book 1 of the Faerie Queene. And what these two stanzas do, the whole scene really, is establish a fidelity or faithfulness as an essential quality of true love. Britomart says, for knight to leave his lady were great shame, and better were to die. And she repeats that sentiment when she encounters Scudamore in Canto 11. And there are a number of other characters who are faithful to their beloveds, almost to a fault. Florimel, Timaeus, Amoret, and of course Britomart herself and her love for Artegall. Stanza 43 in Canto 1 is a really good example of an epic simile. Spenser, these are all over the place, and I chose this one because I think it's particularly good, particularly visual and well written. Britomart, in the stanza, she lifts the umbriere, the visor of her helmet, and Spenser compares the disclosure of her beauty to moonlight breaking through the clouds. The moon, of course, being a symbol of Diana and chastity. And these extended similes, like you see this one here, they take the entire stanza, and they are a staple of epic poetry. In stanza 46, we get this really nice expression of Britomart's hybrid nature as a beautiful female knight. There are other lines like this one, but I find these to be particularly good. For she was full of amiable grace, and manly terror mixed therewithal. That is the one, that is, as her grace stirred up affection's base, so the other, the manly terror, did men's rash desires appall and hold them back, that would in error fall. Really nice description of the duality of Britomart. Stanza 49 is a good example of authorial intrusion. Spenser's he's been describing the orgiastic scenes in Castle Joyous. And then he intrudes here, as he often does in the Faerie Queene, to moralize on his narrative, this time trying to clarify for his female readers the distinction between chaste love and lust, emphasizing that Malatesta is rather the exception among women than the rule. It's almost like he's apologizing to female readers for Malatesta. She doesn't represent all women. She's just one. Just like there were many angels in heaven and some of them fell. And then in stanza 4, we get a little bit of Bridomart's naivete, her sexual innocence. And this makes her vulnerable to Malatesta's overtures, which she mistakes as being motivated by the same feelings as she has for Artegall. And that leaves her exposed. I think that's an interesting idea. It comes through. So moving on to Canto 2, stanzas, kind of a long section here, stanzas 39 to 44. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. This is Britomart revealing to Glossy her feelings for Artegall. I'm talking about Canto 2, stanzas 39 to 44, Britomart's desire. She reveals her feelings for Artegall. Glossy goes to lengths to explain that what she feels is love and not lust, which is merely sensual and a vice. And yet what I find really fascinating about this particular moment in these stanzas is that Britomart expresses the desire for physical intimacy, and she challenges Glossy's advice by pointing out that wicked women, however sinful, however impure their motives are, at least they have the satisfaction of physical contact. She says, she has this great line, Britomart does, where she says, "I feed on shadows while I die for food." I feed on shadows while I die for food. I think that's a great line. So now, in Canto 4, I'm skipping through Canto 3 to Canto 4. This is Britomart. She's on the coast, stanzas 7 through 10. Having parted ways with Redcross, she arrives on this desolate beach, and there are some nice passages here describing the ocean as the objective correlative of her unrequited passion for Artegall. She apostrophizes the ocean here and employs the somewhat shop-worn Petrarchan conceit of the lover as an endangered vessel adrift on rough waters. And we see similar metaphors in the sonnets of Surrey and Wyatt, for example. But this is a really, I think these are really lovely. This is a really lovely section of the poem. In stanzas 26 to 28, we get, although some of Spenser's characters, like Belphoebe, for instance, represent a virginal ideal, Spenser, he can be ambivalent about this. He makes clear that the virtue of chastity does not negate or repel romantic love. And so attempts to deny love typically lead to disaster. And Marinella is the best case for that. His mother, Cymewint, has been told by Proteus that Marinella will be deeply hurt by a woman, which she ironically interprets to mean heartbreak rather than defeat in a contest of arms. And this leads to her advising Marinella to avoid women, not realizing, of course, that he would be confronted by a woman on the battlefield. So in stanzas 55 to 60, near the very end of Book 4, this is Arthur's night complaint. This is an apostrophe to night. He's been trying to catch up with Florimel, and this futile pursuit awakens his longing for Gloriana, the Faerie Queene. And these feelings are especially excruciating at night. This is another common theme of Petrarchanized Renaissance love poetry, and I think it's a really good complaint and worth reading. In Canto 5, stanzas 51 to 54, this is Timaeus and Belphoebe. Timaeus has been rescued by her, but he's wasting away due to his unrequited love for her. And as Spenser's idol of chastity, Belphoebe can't requite Timaeus's love. But what's especially curious here is how Spenser presents Belphoebe as an ambiguous model for female virtue. I'm going to quote him here. He says, to your fair selves, a fair ensample frame of this fair virgin, this Belphoebe fair, to whom in perfect love and spotless fame of chastity none living may compare. So on the one hand, Belphoebe's chastity is worthy of emulation. She's someone that Spenser believes his female readers should look to as an example. But on the other, as he implies elsewhere in the poem, men and women can't and shouldn't reject love. And this ambiguity forms the centerpiece of Book 3, Canto 6, which is the Garden of Adonis. So we'll get into Canto 6 now. We'll look at just a brief moment, stanzas 21 to 22. While searching for her wayward son, Cupid, Venus is confronted by the virgin goddess Diana. They don't get along. They don't like each other, it seems. Diana chastises her for awakening men's sexual desires. But interestingly, Venus fires back and she defends herself. And she argues that chastity has its place in the world, but so too does sensual pleasure and physical intimacy. And just one of her lines that captures this is she says, we both are bound to follow heaven's behests and tend our charges with obeisance meek. So it's like she's saying we both have our place. Chastity has its place, and so does sensual pleasure and physical intimacy, which of course Venus represents. And finally, the last episode I want you to revisit from Book 3, the first half of Book 3 is Canto 6, a long segment, stanzas 30 to 48. This is the Garden of Adonis. Spenser attempts to explain how the spirits of the dead re-enter the world in material form. Really complicated. And it seems strange that Venus's domain would be so broad to include this. You know, this is like the afterlife, right? But I think it's Spenser's attempt to rationalize or to idealize sexual intimacy, to chasten it in a way by making it instrumental to the larger cycle of life, death, and regeneration. And it's curious, too, that Venus's mortal lover, Adonis, who, according to classical precedent, died in a hunting accident, that he plays a significant role in this cycle as well. So it's a long and difficult and in some ways inconsistent account. And it's worth spending some time, I think, reading and puzzling through it. Okay, we'll go on now and do cantos 7 through 12 of Book 3. And again, we'll start with just a summary of each of the cantos, and then I will end by directing you to some specific passages or scenes that I would like for you to read and think about. So, Canto 7 begins with Arthur and Florimel. So Florimel she's still on the run from the forester and from Arthur, and she finds refuge at the house of a witch and her son. So yet another mother-son relationship. Fathers are curiously absent from Book 3 of the Faerie Queene. And the son, who is kind of a lie-about and slothful, lusts after her and woos her with attention and gifts in these stanzas. In stanzas 21 through 28, she's rested, she's recovered from the earlier trials of the forester and being chased all over the place by Arthur, and she's put off by the son's unwanted advances, so she leaves the cottage, and the son, obviously upset, His mother doesn't know what to do, so she sends this hyena-like monster to capture or kill Florimel, and she winds up escaping in a fishing boat, and that the fisherman is sleeping inside of it, and he's going to become another problem a little later. But and then the monster devours her horse. In stanzas 29 to 36, Saturain, the knight, arrives on the scene, and he subdues the monster, but he sees her horse has been eaten and some of the articles that she was wearing, and Florimel is gone, and he worries that she might be dead. Stanzas 37 through 44, so after rescuing the Squire of Dames, Saturain is himself snatched up by the giantess Argante, and is rescued by this very mysterious female knight named Paladine. She rides in and chases off Argante, and she is never seen again, which is rather strange. And then in stanzas 45 to 61, the squire tells Saturain of the labors imposed upon him by his beloved Columbell, and how he was apprehended by Argante. And we'll take a closer look at some of that material a little later in this video. So we'll move on to Canto 8 now, and stanzas 1 through 19, going back to Florimel now. That storyline, believing her to have been killed by the monster, the witch's son falls into a deep despair, and the witch, a little exasperated by this behavior, uses her magic to create a double of Florimel that fits the Petrarchan mold of beauty. But curiously, I think this double is animated by a male demon. And interesting that Spenser makes a point of that. She gives the double to her son, who quickly loses him to the false knight Braggadocio, who's a recurring villain in the Faerie Queene. And he, not long after he gets her, he loses her to yet another knight. So there's this counterfeit Florimel in circulation that nobody knows about, which is bizarre. Stanzas 20 to 28, Florimel is raped by the fisherman. So one of the phrases that stands out from these stanzas: new waves of weary wretchedness. That's what Florimel's life has been like up to this point. New waves of weary wretchedness. She's just constantly harassed and persecuted. Stanzas 29 to 42, Florimel is rescued by Proteus, and for a while you think, well, this is a good thing, but then he begins to lust after her too, and tries various strategies to win her over. But again, she's in love with Sir Marinell, and she's not interested. He's enraged by her resistance, and he imprisons her in his undersea bower. Stanzas 43 to 52, Saturain and the squire meet up with this other knight named Paradel, who tells them that as soon as she heard of Sir Marinell's injury, Florimel left the fairy court. This is the same story that Arthur got earlier from the dwarf, to go in search of Marinell. And a number of knights have gone in search of her, and Paradel is one of them. Saturain, who found her horse devoured, fears that she may be dead, but he agrees to accompany Paradel in the search. And they decide, the Squire of Dames is with him, and they decide to seek shelter at a nearby house belonging to a man named Malbecco, who refuses to let them in. And in Canto 9, we get the explanation for this behavior. It starts with a proem, which I talked about earlier. I think this is, for me anyway, this is one of the most interesting poems in Book 3. But in stanzas 3 through 8, the Squire of Dames explains that Malbecco is this much older man. He has this pretty young wife, and he can no longer perform sexually. The squire says he is old and withered like hay, unfit fair lady's service to supply. I mean, he can't have sexual intimacy with a woman, and the privy guilt whereof makes him always suspect her truth. So he's a cuckold. He lives in fear of his wife's infidelity, and she is unfaithful to him. So he's turned into a cuckold, and keeping an eye on his wife Eleanor is a full-time job for him. Stanzas 9 through 18. Britomart arrives and joins with them. There's a little fight that she has with Paradel. But again, just as was the case with Guyon in Canto 1, Saturaine manages to make peace, and they all join together to force Malbecco to let them into the house. They start to catch the house on fire, which of course alarms Malbecco because he's hoarding his money in the house, and that's a little bit of foreshadowing because his wife Eleanor is going to burn up some of his stash a little later. Stanzas 19 to 31. Basically, Paradel lusting after Eleanor. They're all feasting together, and despite Malbecco's careful observation, Paradel manages to flirt with Eleanor and write little messages for her with wine on the tabletop and so forth. Stanzas 32 to 53, Paradel and Britomart. This is a really long section. I think readers really struggle with this part. Paradel and Britomart trace their ancestry back to ancient Troy, and Britomart tells how England was colonized by descendants of Aeneas. And I think this section of Book 9 or Canto 9 contains some of the allusions to what was going on in Ireland at the time, and the language that was used to describe the Irish surfaces in some of the stanzas here in Book 9 when Britomart describes the early colonization of England. And we're going to look at more of that in just a few minutes. So Canto 10 now, stanzas 1 through 11. This is Paradel's seduction of Eleanor, and we'll come back and revisit that in a little while. Stanzas 12 through 16. So in addition to his being a cuckold, Malbecco, we learn, is also a miser. He's a money hoarder, and Eleanor uses that to her advantage by catching it on fire and creating a distraction so that she can elope with Paradel, who has now completely seduced her, which doesn't appear to have been that hard in the first place. Stanzas 17 through 34, he encounters, he goes after his wife and meets up with Braggadocio and his squire, Trumpert, and he tells them his troubles and says he will pay handsomely to anyone who helps him recover his wife. Braggadocio and his squire agree to do this, but of course they're really more interested in taking his money than in finding Eleanor, and that will be borne out a little later. Stanzas 35 to 42, Paradel tells Malbecco that they find Paradel, but there's no Eleanor, and Paradel tells Malbecco, yes, we had sex. His phrase for it is that he filched her bells, and then he dumped her, but that she was taken in by the satyrs that live in a nearby forest. So Braggadocio and Trumpert succeed at getting Malbecco to hide his money before entering the forest. They say, oh, there are all these all these robbers in there, and your money's going to be really heavy. It's going to be hard to navigate through the forest. So they convince him to hide the money, to stash it somewhere. And of course, their intent is to ditch him and go back and take the money themselves, which they in fact do. Stanzas 43 to 53. This is Malbeco's failed attempt to recover his wife, and we'll take a closer look at that in a moment. Helenor among the satyrs. So in stanzas 54 to 60, having lost both Helenor and his fortune at this point, and realizing that he loses his mind, goes mad, and transforms into the monster Jealousy. So Canto 11 begins with a very short poem. I don't know if you'd really call it a poem. It's more like an extended transition on the topic of jealousy. And then in stanzas 3 through 6, Satyrane and Britomart pursue the giant Oliphant who has abducted some young man. This is, remember, Argante's twin brother, with whom she's carried on an incestuous relationship since they were conceived in the womb. And they rescue him, but in the process of rescuing him and going after Oliphant, they are separated. So Satyrane and Britomart are separated. In stanzas 7 through 13, Britomart discovers the knight Scudamore, who tells her of Amoret's captivity in the house of Buzzirain, that Buzzirain is trying to convince her to give up her love for Scudamore. In stanzas 14 through 20, Britomart encourages him, offers to help rescue Amoret. And then in stanzas 21 through 27, she gets an entrance to Buzzirain's castle. She's able to penetrate the gate of fire that protects the castle. But Scudamore, interestingly, he fails. And Spenser implies that Scudamore's motives are not pure. He has a greedy will, Spenser says, and envious desire, which, of course, do not align with the virtue of chastity represented by Britomart. So he is kept out of the castle, and she enters alone. Stanzas 28 to 46. She surveys the Hall of Tapestries. Just really wonderful. I love this part of the poem, the description of all these gods and their loves. Reminds me a lot of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which I'll talk more about a little later in the video. Stanzas 47 to 49, there's a description of the altar of love. And then this canto ends with Britomart discovering these doors with these messages: be bold and be not too bold. And we'll go back and look at that scene as well in a moment. So the last canto, stanzas 1 through 18, this is the Mask of Cupid. It's a train of figures that enter in pairs, personifying motives and emotions that work against true love. So very highly allegorical. Stanzas 19 through 27 continue that, but we now get a glimpse of Amoret for the first time since book 6. And Cupid appears here as a really sadistic, very sinister figure, gloating over Amoret, whose bloody heart is brought out on a dish. And he's accompanied by yet more personifications of the negative outcomes of love, like reproach and repentance and shame and so forth, all of which seems designed to deter Britomart from proceeding any further. Stanzas 28 to 42, Britomart, she does pass through the iron door that says, be not too bold, and she rescues Amoret and captures Buzzirain, who's in there torturing her. And then finally, in stanzas 43 to 47, book 3 ends with Scudamore united with Amoret. And we'll take a look at this scene. It's pretty strange. Their love is physical, but somehow it transcends sensual pleasure. Spenser says no earthly thing they felt, even though they're united together. So we'll take a closer look at that moment as well. So having finished the summary then, I just want to point out about a dozen different scenes here that I'd like for you to think about. The first is in Canto 7, stanzas 54 to 60, the labors of the squire. So in these stanzas, the squire of dames tells Saturne of his love for this woman named Columbell, and the challenge she gave him to seduce as many women as possible in the course of a year, and then to report his successes to her. He's like, no problem. So he goes out and does this, not realizing that her challenge will have this impossible follow-up, which is to find just as many virtuous women who will resist him. And he says so far he's found only 3. A prostitute who won't have sex with him because he won't pay her for it. A nun who won't have sex with him, not because she doesn't want to, but because she doesn't trust him to keep his mouth shut about it, which is Spenser making a little dig at Catholicism there. And then finally, the only one who is genuinely chaste is a country girl, quote, of low degree, unquote. So it's interesting to consider the implications of this, considering that Spenser's sophisticated and urbane readership probably would not have identified with this rustic girl. So interesting too, because in so many other places in the Faerie Queene in Book 3, he reassures readers that loose women are the exception and not the rule. But that has not been the squire's experience. So the next scene I want you to take a closer look at, is in Canto 8, and this is stanzas 21 to 27. It's the most disturbing in the entire book, I think. It's a really graphic depiction of sexual assault. Florimel has escaped the hyena-like monster sent by the witch. She pushed off in a boat carrying a sleeping fisherman, and then he wakes up, and then he immediately attempts to rape her. The language is euphemistic, of course, but there's no mistaking Spenser's description of the fisherman's engorged genitals, and then his description of the filthy boat bottom, and Florimel, she's like covered in fish scales, and this gives the scene a kind of unusual, gritty realism for this allegorical poem. And it doesn't, this kind of realism, at least it seems realistic to me, the fish scales sticking to her body. That kind of detail doesn't occur too often in the Faerie Queene. Also in Book 8 is another reference to an aspect of the virtue of chastity is fidelity or constancy. Then after being rescued, then courted, and then coerced, and then finally imprisoned by the sea god Proteus, Spenser praises Florimel's constancy, even if it is for Marinell, who's at this point is extremely misogynistic because of his mother's Simont's education of him about women. So in Canto 9, just stanzas 6 and 7, just kind of a comical little bit that I think is worth reading. Malbeco's cuckoldry is the subject of this book, and he's extremely jealous, as I said earlier, of his younger wife Helenor. And I think that Spenser was probably thinking of his idol Chaucer, specifically the Miller's Tale here, in which Alison cuckolds her husband John in a really famous fablio. And so Spenser or Malbeco goes to really great lengths to keep her away from men. But in these passages, Saturn comments comically on the futility of these strategies, that cuckolded men rarely are successful at keeping their wives faithful to them. And of course, he turns out to be absolutely right about this. as we learn in Book 10. The really long part of Canto 9, the Trojan ancestry, this is a large section that's given over to Paridel and Britomart, tracing their ancestry back to ancient Troy. Paridel claims to be a descendant of Paris, who ran off with Helen, starting the Trojan War. And then Britomart claims to be descended from Aeneas, whose grandson Brutus supposedly settled England and became its first king. Why is this important? Well, this attempt to link English history with classical antiquity was a major feature of Renaissance culture, and not just in England. These ancient civilizations, Greece and Rome, were widely admired for their art, for their philosophy, their learning, their government, their laws, and of course for their military prowess. So to be able to claim some identity with these ancient civilizations was a means of establishing cultural legitimacy, not just locally, but also on a really broad geopolitical scale. So in Canto 10, Paridel seduces Helenor, and the stanzas that I've identified here, 6 through 11, they basically are Spenser satirizing the courtly love tradition. Paridel makes a mockery of it. His melancholy histrionics, his love poems, and his disingenuous declarations of loyalty and service are a clear warning to Spenser's readers, again, whom he constantly refers to as female in Book 3, to be wary of false appearances. That just because someone acts the part doesn't mean that they are going to follow through. So stanzas 44 to 48, this is after Paridel abandons Helenor and she is taken in by a herd of satyrs, which were notorious in antiquity for their drunken lasciviousness, often portrayed on Greek vases with erect phalluses and so forth. And she's made into a kind of concubine to them. So just quoting from one of the stanzas here, amongst them she lay, embraced of a satyr rough and rude, who all the night did mind his joyous play. 9 times Malbecco heard him come aloft ere day. So that's pretty explicit. And this is probably what Spenser had in mind when he issued the warning to his readers in the proem to Book 9 about Helenor. Stanzas 56 to 60, this is Malbecco's transformation into the monster Jealousy, an obvious imitation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is a series of mythological tales, very often erotic in nature, which culminate with characters' elaborate transformations into plants and animals and natural phenomena. And this had a really significant influence on many Renaissance poets, not just in England and not just Spenser. So it's worth reading that. It's very Ovidian in its length and in its manner and detail. So moving on to Canto 11, looking at stanzas 46 through 49, Britomart has entered the house of Buzzy-Rain to rescue Amoret, and everything that she finds inside the house seems intended to show the influence that love wields over both gods and men. And in these passages, Spenser describes the tapestries and then an altar to Cupid that decorates the first room. And as Britomart examines these objects and further explores the room, the message becomes clear that love involves risking one's happiness. Over one of the doors is written the phrase "Be bold," and behind which she goes through and she discovers innumerable relics of failed love. And then another door in stanza 54 that's warning her, "Be not too bold." So this is an iron door. with this ominous warning. And of course, she's going to go through it because there's no other way to get to Amoret. In Canto 12, stanzas 3 through 27, a really long segment, but it's the mask of Cupid. At first, she sees the mask come through that iron door. It's a really spectacular parade, a procession. And Cupid, as I said earlier, he appears here as this sort of sadistic, bloodthirsty god, accompanied by all the hazards of romantic love personified. Amoret is with him. She's beleaguered and tortured brutally. And yet, despite being treated this way, she remains steadfastly loyal to Scudamore, who, remember, is outside and couldn't get into the castle to rescue her. So the following day, Britomart goes through the iron door and releases Amoret from Busseraine's his clutches. He's casting spells on her and trying to convert her. Spenser seems to suggest that by doing this, by being bold, and not being frightened or cowed, that she has now acquired the level of knowledge and experience that she's going to need to succeed in her own quest for Artegal. And she won't get to him until book 4, and then she winds up rescuing him from another woman, an Amazon queen, in book 5. So finally, the very end of book 3 is the union of Scudamore and Amoret. And I've already talked a little bit about this earlier. This is the original ending of book 3. So when he published the 6th book, Faerie Queene, 6 years later, he had to rewrite this ending, and Amoret is not united with Scudamore at the end of that version. But after rescuing Amoret and capturing Busserraine, Amoret and Scudamore united, grown together quite. A curious phrase to describe their union, that they've grown together. And really curious, Spenser compares them to the Greek god Hermaphroditus, the fusion of the male and female. Or more accurately, Spenser compares them to an artwork representing Hermaphroditus. So our only example in book 3 of happily united lovers is this bizarre kind of it's a very strange resolution to book 3. And I'll just leave you with the question of what this conclusion tells us about Spenser's ideal love. And we can certainly carry on that discussion in our class discussion. And that concludes this video on Edmund Spenser and book 3 of the Faerie Queene. The discovery of Adonis there.